Good morning, good afternoon to everybody who's logged into this webinar, depending on what time zone you're phoning in from. This is an APM webinar from the People SIG and also the Stakeholder Engagement Focus Group. So I'd very much like to welcome Dr. Christine Unterhitzenberger from Liverpool John Moores University. Christine is Senior Lecturer in Project Management at the university, and before her academic career was project manager for more than 10 years in the construction industry. She is going to talk to us today about stakeholder challenges, and the title of her talk is Stakeholder Challenge, Dealing with Difficult Stakeholders. So without further ado, I would like to hand you over. Christine.
Thank you very much, Ben. A warm welcome to everyone from my side as well. And thank you for joining in for our webinar today. As Ben mentioned, I'll be talking about the stakeholder challenge and strategies for dealing with difficult stakeholders, or more precisely with difficult situations involving stakeholders in projects. And first of all, I would like to give you a quick overview who was involved in the research we've done. Because what I'm talking about today is not only based on my experience, but it is a research project which was funded by the Association for Project Management. I'm going to give you a little bit of background and the methodology which we used, and then I'm going to present the findings, our conclusion, and some practical recommendations. And as Ben mentioned, at the end, we will have time for Q&A. The research team. We worked on this research project as a group of academics and a group of practitioners. So there are a few colleagues from Liverpool Business School. It is myself, Professor David Bride, and Dr. Hannah Wilson. And then there are Roger Joby and Jake Holloway as practitioners who also were involved in the project. And when we talk about stakeholders, I'm pretty sure that most of you have come across a situation like shown here on the slide. That first the client is happy, and half an hour later, he or she might have changed their mind. We might also have stakeholders in our project who don't always align with the goals we have in the project and basically try to escape our project. Or we might have different stakeholder groups who have, really different goals and pull into completely different directions for the project. And then it is often the question, how do we as project managers deal with these situations? Do we try to strangle the difficult stakeholder, which is probably not the most appropriate response? Do we just put our head down and try to ignore everything? Or do we just meditate and hope everything will be resolved by itself? So these can be quite difficult situations, and we need to find a bit more appropriate ways on how to deal and cope with them. And therefore, I would like to give you a bit of quick background on stakeholders and the approach we used in our research. In general, stakeholders, as you probably know, are individuals and groups whose interests can be affected both positively or negatively by the project. So it's basically everyone who is in some way affected by the project. This can be directly project team members, can be the client, but it can also be people outside the project organization. In construction projects, it's often neighbors or authorities. And stakeholders often have very different needs, objectives, responsibilities, values, and priorities. As the group of stakeholders can be very, very diverse in projects. This leads to these different needs and also objectives, what they have towards the project. And the problem for the project manager, or more the challenge for the project manager, is that the stakeholders are often outside the authority of the project manager. So that means the project manager doesn't really have access to them or doesn't have any kind of authority, any means of managing them. And then we also have the diversity paradox with stakeholders. We need a very diverse group of people in our projects to make the projects work, because they're often very complex and we need different skills, often different organizations. But exactly this diversity also causes more tensions and more difficulties in projects. So due to these challenges which we face in projects with the stakeholders, project managers often encounter apathy or mild resistance or even outright hostility from stakeholders. And this can cause quite a bit of stress and discomfort for the stakeholder, for the project manager. And therefore, we need to develop strategies how project managers can overcome the stress and discomfort. So how can we support project managers to become more resilient in dealing with the difficult stakeholders? And we use the theory of coping strategies to investigate that. And coping strategies, or coping, is generally defined as the thoughts and behaviors used to manage the internal and external demands of situations that are appraised to be stressful. So it is basically our way of thinking, and also then our actions of what we do in order to manage stressful situations. And research has found that there are two different ways or two different approaches to coping. One is the emotion-focused coping, and the other one is the problem-focused coping. Emotion-focused coping very much deals, as the name says, with the emotions. So if we become angry or upset or annoyed because of a stakeholder in our context, then the emotion-focused coping would look at how can we best deal with these emotions. Whereas the problem-focused coping would look at, for example, if a difficult stakeholder creates a situation which leads to delays in the project, the problem-focused coping would look at how we can address these delays. And there are three functional processes which we use. The first one is alter the situation. So we would look at how can we change or improve the situation which made this difficulty and which caused the need for us to cope with something. The second one is alter the meaning. So we would look into, is our understanding of the situation correct? And the third one is adapting the situation. So how can we adapt the situation that becomes less stressful and challenging? And we developed the research question: how do project managers deal with difficult situations involving stakeholders? So this was the aim of our research, to find out how do project managers actually deal with these situations. Regarding the wording, you might notice that we haven't used how do project managers deal with difficult stakeholders, which we had intended to use, but we found out very quickly that it is not actually the stakeholder who is necessarily difficult, but that it might also be situations. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail a little bit later. How did we find out about our research, or what did we do to investigate? We conducted 12 semi-structured interviews. They lasted between 45 and 60 minutes. They were in different industries. We had participants from the construction industry, from IT, and also pharma. Then we developed a conceptual framework. And then 5 of the participants came back and we conducted a validation focus group with them. And based on that, we developed the validated conceptual framework. And we used so-called situational questioning with them. So when we interviewed the participants, we, for example, asked, what is your experience as a project manager of difficult stakeholders? And or we asked, how have you experienced the difficult situation? So it was very much focused on real situations our participants have experienced. And we asked them all to describe 2 situations. So in total, we had 24 difficult situations which we've analyzed. And now we come to the findings of our research. The difficult situations and their causes. And this relates back to what I mentioned earlier, that it is not necessarily a difficult stakeholder. We found that difficult situations involving stakeholders can be created based on various causes. One of the causes is the structural environment. This means that a stakeholder can appear to be difficult because he or she causes a difficult situation due to the structural environment of the project. That is, for example, if a stakeholder is unknown. So if we didn't know that this stakeholder exists, and for example, if we then subsequently ignored this stakeholder, this might cause a difficult situation. It is also the power and the influence of the stakeholder, or the role versus the project pressure. So these are structural elements of the environment of the project, which can cause difficult situations. An example for that is, as it developed, you began to realize where these different agendas were. So this is a quote of one of our participants. And exactly these different agendas are often based on, for example, the role versus the project pressure. A second point is the social environment. A stakeholder can also appear to be difficult because he or she causes a difficult situation due to the social environment of the project. And this is, for example, the building and maintaining of relationships and communication and trust. So this is very much about the social aspects of the project. And if stakeholders have experience with each other, for example, if they have worked on previous projects together. And the third one is the stakeholder, him or herself. And this is when the stakeholder, him or herself, is difficult in their own right. And this can be the case, for example, based on their personality, when people are not honest, or when they show arrogance. It might also be their role or their expectations. But when it is basically not based on the environment of the project, but when the individual, him or herself, is difficult. And an example for that, which was mentioned during our interviews, was when you have a personality clash with somebody, it can be quite difficult to move things forward. So this shows that we can't simply say dealing with difficult stakeholders, because there is much more to it than just the difficult stakeholder. And we need to become aware what is the reason for why a person is difficult or why a stakeholder is difficult. Is it because of the structural environment of our project? Is it because of the social environment of our project? Or is it because of the stakeholder, him or herself? Then we also found that these difficult situations can have a significant impact. And the first impact these difficult situations can have is on the project. I'm sure you all experienced situations like that, difficult situation with a stakeholder, and you probably know that there is an impact on the project. It is very important to keep in mind that this impact of a difficult situation is usually temporary. So it doesn't go on and on and on, and it's a temporary incident in a project. And the impact can be positive or negative. Often when we think about a difficult situation, or a difficult stakeholder, we immediately think of a negative impact. But what we found with our research is that there can be quite a positive impact on the project as well, which might be, for example, organizational learning. So when we actually learn something from the situation, or it might be a restructure of the project, which then delivered a better result. And the impact is often on the iron triangle, cost, time, quality, but it is also impact on goals and scope of the project, on key stakeholder satisfaction, organizational learning, as I mentioned, or staff turnover. And these are just a few examples. For example, our participants mentioned, it cost us a little bit more. So this would obviously be a negative impact of the project. Another quote is swaying the direction of a decision based on their own personal or organizational needs rather than the project as a whole. This would also be an example of a negative impact on the project, and more precisely probably on the goals and the scope of the project. The second impact difficult situations can have is the personal impact. And this is the impact on the project manager, him or herself. Again, this impact can be positive or negative. And we have the differentiation between the impact on the role of the project manager and the impact on the personal well-being. So the impact on the role of the project manager would mean that it has, for example, an influence on our professional learning, on the reputation, or on the Weltanschauung. So how do we perceive the reality? A difficult situation with a stakeholder can potentially have a very damaging impact on the reputation of a project manager if it isn't resolved properly. So the impact would be here on the role of the project manager. But then we also have an impact on the personal well-being. And this can be frustration, unease, resistance, anger, isolation, helplessness. And these are quite common reactions. And we found that pretty much all difficult situations which we've investigated also had an impact on the personal well-being of the project manager. And yeah, it created situations where it was just resistance, like, no, I'm not going to do anything anymore with this, or don't want to have anything to do with that. But it was also helplessness. What am I going to do? I don't know how to deal with this situation. I don't know how to deal with this stakeholder. And our interviewees appreciated that difficult situations gave them the opportunity to learn new lessons, like this quote here shows. But it also showed like their fear, like, I thought I might get sacked because of this difficult situation. Or I felt a little bit upset. We often don't mention these things, and we often don't admit that we might feel upset, that we might feel helpless. But our interviews actually showed that it is quite a common reaction of project managers to have these emotions and the impact on the personal well-being based on difficult situation stakeholders. So we looked at the coping strategies, and we found that the project managers adopt two different types of coping strategies. The first one is coping strategies for the project. So the project managers look into what can we do for the project to best cope with the situation. That might be a restructure of the project team or of the project. They might introduce more detailed monitoring and control, or additional monitoring and control. For some, it is that they passed on the role of the project manager to someone else, or that they restructured regarding the members of the project team. Another way is to encourage the stakeholder engagement from a project perspective, to actually get more involved with the stakeholders. So the first and the most important aspect for the project managers in general when we talked to them was the project coping strategy. So what can we do to kind of minimize the impact on or minimize the negative impact on the project, and how can the project best cope with the situation? But then when we talked a little bit longer and got a bit more into detail, it became very clear that there are also personal coping strategies. So that project managers also look how they themselves can cope best with the situation. And here we have this division of what I mentioned before, of the problem focused and the emotion focused coping. The problem focused attempts to deal with the problem or the difficult situation. So this is often within, or this is generally within the project environment. It uses measures like communication, relationship building, or simply trying a different approach with this individual or with the situation. Whereas the emotion focused coping, as the name says, focuses on the emotions of the project manager and how to deal with them. And this often takes place outside the project environment. It is done, for example, through self-validation, through venting, reflecting, sharing, or confrontation. So this is has a lot to do with how the project managers cope with their emotions. And what we found is that they often either kind of take it home, share it with their family, with their partner, with their friends, or that they write diaries to kind of reflect on what has happened and to try to then learn from these situations. Or it might also be that they share with their colleagues who are not necessarily in the same project. So it is usually or very often outside the project environment. Based on these findings, we have developed this framework. So on the left-hand side, you can see the causes for the difficult situation, which is the structural environment, the social environment, and the stakeholder, him or herself. The big orange box in the middle represents the project, and the white area outside is basically outside the project. And the causes for the difficult situation can come from outside the project or from within the project. And when we have this difficult situation, this then has an impact, which you can see at the bottom, on the project as well as on the person of the project manager. The project impact is sometimes within the project, but partly it can also be outside of the project. For example, if a project gets delayed through a difficult situation, yes, this has an impact on the project and on the schedule, but it might also have an impact on the production scale and therefore delivery of items later on. Then the personal impact, as I mentioned before, the division of impact on role and impact on well-being. The impact on the role of the project manager is usually within the project, whereas the impact on the well-being is mostly outside the project. It's the personal impact on the personal well-being of the project manager. And then, based on this impact, coping strategies are developed. And as well as for the project and the personal impact, project managers use project coping strategies to find ways how the project can deal best with the difficult situation. And the personal coping strategies, which are divided into the problem focused and the emotion focused. So what does this actually mean? Our conclusion was that yes, there are the personal and the project coping strategies, which are important for the project manager to consider. These can be, as I mentioned before, restructuring of project or the project team, monitor and control the situation as well as the project, stakeholder engagement, or the development of a plan B. This might also be communication with the team, relationship building, identification of common ground, the self-validation, sharing, reflecting, and the demonstration of personal values. And it is also important to keep in mind that coping can occur both within and outside the project context. It is not always that we do it within the project. And last but not least, we don't just have a difficult stakeholder. We need to identify the causes for the difficult situation involving the stakeholder in order to then subsequently decide what to do and how to best deal with it. And it is also that project managers develop coping strategies over time. So we found that the more experienced project managers who have been working in this role for many years developed coping strategies which work best for them personally to deal with the difficult situation and overcome the impact on the project as well as on themselves. And they said, well, at the beginning of my career, I would probably have dealt differently with it, or I wouldn't have been able to cope in the way I can do now. So this is also an important learning, that we need to become aware of how we cope with it, with difficult situations involving stakeholders, and then find what does work best for us, for each individual. And to wrap up my presentation now, I would like to present some recommendations which are hopefully helpful tips for you. So first of all, we would recommend that you try to understand why a stakeholder is being difficult in your project and what the origin of the difficulty is. So is it the social environment? Is it the structural environment? Or is it the stakeholder personality? Then as a next step, you would evaluate the impact of the difficult situation on the project, but also on yourself. And when you evaluate the impact on yourself, it would be in terms of your role as well as your personal well-being. And if the difficult situation has an impact on the project, identify and adopt measures to limit the negative impact. If the difficult situation has an impact on you as the project manager, be aware of the difficult dimensions of the impact. So be aware, what is the impact on your role and what is the impact on your personal well-being? And then use problem and or emotion-focused measures to reduce the negative impact. And this brings my presentation to an end. This was an initial study which we conducted, and we hope to conduct further research in this area, which looks especially at the personality differences of project managers and how the different personalities adopt different coping strategies. But this is a work for the future. And I would like to now hand over to Ben, who will present us with some questions which you've asked throughout the webinar.
Thank you very much, Christine, for that very interesting talk. It raised a lot of questions in my mind. You talk about the coping strategies and the emotion-focused coping strategy and the problem-focused coping strategy. Are there any other types? I mean, that seems like a pretty good, pretty complete model. But I just wondered if you'd come across anything that included other types of coping strategy as well.
No, these are the ones which are like established through research and which have been validated multiple times, and the problem and the emotion focused are basically the two leading areas. What we now have found with this study is that we have the personal and the project coping as well, which project managers adopt, but this looks at a different aspect more of the environment.
Okay, thanks. And the questions are now flooding through. Christine, we've got a question here. It says, one of our clients has a culture of requesting key staff removal from project teams as a means of demonstrating their corporate dominance. From your research, is this unusual, and do you have a coping suggestion for it?
Well, it is difficult to say now from the distance, but this would, for me, be probably a structural, the reasons like from the structural project environment. And regarding the coping, we would have to look into more detail, but it is probably a combination of project and personal coping. Regarding the project, it might be to engage more with the client, to kind of get a better understanding with the client and try to emphasize and communicate that there are common goals and that it is not necessarily helpful to build this adversarial environment. But we would look we would have to look more into detail. It's difficult to give a diagnosis in distance.
Understood. A question from my colleague Fern, who's in the stakeholder engagement focus group, and Fern asks, how can project managers assess the effectiveness of their coping strategies? And how do you know when a difficult situation has been mitigated or simply been temporarily abated?
This is a very good question, and we have not yet looked at this aspect of coping in the project environment. So unfortunately, I can't answer this question yet. We have to do a bit of further research on that.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a nice call there for further research in this area.
Definitely.
So. One of the questions relates to real life examples of coping strategies. So, do you have a real life example of a coping strategy that you could share with us rather than a theoretical model?
Well, the theoretical model is basically built on the various situations which were described by our interviewees, and we investigated and analyzed the real examples. And I'm just thinking of if there is one which I
something that isn't confidential.
Yes. Yeah. One interviewee, for example, said that their client was. It was first described that the client was a very difficult person to deal with, and over our conversation and over basically sharing it with us, it became more clear that what are the motivations of the client, why was this person difficult, and the coping which the project manager basically described was that they shared a lot with their colleagues. So regarding the personal coping and the well-being, it is often talking to colleagues and talking to friends, which then helps us to kind of process our emotions better.
Great, thank you very much for that. Another question, which is sort of posing an assumption, really, which you're being asked to sort of validate or not. If both the stakeholder and the project manager both believe they're right, should we defer to the impact on the personal and project coping strategies? So presumably the person who's raised this question is thinking that via some analysis on the strategies that you could do it in quite a sort of objective way.
Yeah, again, it depends on the situation. If both think they are right, and if the situation can't be solved, then what we had is what I brought as a quote as well, I think. Sometimes it is necessary to replace people and to make changes to the project team, because there can be clashes of personality, which might be the case when both think they are right, which is perfectly fair and which is not the fault of anyone if two personalities don't get along well. But then for the benefit of the project, and also for the benefit of the project manager and the individuals involved, it is better to then make a change and say, okay, we either replace the stakeholder or we replace the project manager, depending on what is the situation, and also can we replace the stakeholder, which is not always possible if it is outside the authority of the project manager. Yeah, so I think this would be my answer to that.
Okay. One of the questions is something that actually I was going to ask as well, so I'm really pleased that they've asked it. You were talking about the three processes, so, and I think they were alter the situation, alter the meaning, and adapt the situation. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so the questioner is asking about the functional process alter the meaning, and ask for a concrete example of this so that they could get their heads around what you meant.
So when a process to alter the meaning, for example, if we just try to think of a concrete example and not to describe it too abstract. If a stakeholder communicates in an inappropriate way to us, for example, then and calls us things which we don't think are appropriate, then we could kind of use the coping of alter the meaning and try to set it in context and try to understand the underlying reasons of why this person behaves in this way, and does he or she really mean what they say, or do they just say it in that way because because they had a difficult day, because they were in a traffic jam before they came to the meeting and are really upset. So it is about, altering, for example, the meaning of what someone said by trying to better understand their motivation. Does that make sense?
I think so. So it's back to the idea of making sure you understand the context as well as the actual result and what's hitting you in the face. So one of the questions relates to the number of participants for the research. Did you think that the small number limited the results, or was there a broad range of projects covered by the 12 people? So
as I said, it was kind of an initial study to explore the phenomenon of coping in projects. And what we do with qualitative research is that we collect data until we reach saturation, which means basically until we don't find anything new in the interviews or in our data. And this was the case with our 12 interviews. We basically haven't, after a certain number, we haven't identified any additional concepts or areas based on the questions which we've asked. So yes, it is a small study. It is an exploratory study, but we had reached saturation, and now we need to go deeper into certain areas which we've identified. For example, the personality differences. For example, what was mentioned today, measure the effectiveness of coping. What we also would like to look into is the situations and then directly linked coping, so different difficult situation, and if we can categorize the difficult situation as in some way or the other, we don't know yet. And then how do people cope with different categories of difficult situations. But this is for future work.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. I definitely hope that work comes off, because I'd be fascinated in that, in looking at that. And actually, there's another question relating to sort of potential future research as well. Did your research include looking at preemptive measures like stakeholder mapping and whether they are effective?
No, we did not look at these areas.
Okay. We have a question here. When you know you have to complete a complex project and you keep running into situations which include personality clashes, what coping mechanism do you recommend to manage your own emotions?
For the own emotions, what we found is, and this then depends on the individual person, what works best for them. But as I said before, it would be about reflecting. So what often helps in these situations, especially in personality clashes, is to take a few minutes, sit down, either write it in a journal or think about it, and reflect on the situations and how the person reacted and what you have kind of done, and how the situation could then potentially be improved, or how to react in future situations to get lessons learned on how to deal with it. Another strategy which we found is the personal values, to reassure yourself of the personal values you have and the personal values you work against or towards, so that you basically justify through your personal values how you interact with the other person. So these are the two strategies which come to my mind immediately when we talk about personality clashes.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine. And I'd just like to end with something that one of our listeners, Robert, has raised. He's asked a number of questions, but he ends up by saying, I would like to state that I am experiencing this at the moment in a large-scale project. All the information presented here has been extremely helpful and has put into words the feelings and coping strategies that I require to help go forward. And this has identified that I'm thinking correctly and acting correctly in the best interest from a project and personal viewpoint. Thank you very much. And I shall go away and place these points towards the problem and reflect on what can be done from a realistic perspective. Thank you. So I think that's a nice summing up, really, of some of the emotions of the people that have been listening to you, Christine. And thank you very much for your time. And thank you also to the people who've taken time to call in on their lunch hour or a break in their working day. Just to say that there will be an opportunity to see Christine presenting this topic in the Thames Valley branch in September, on the 19th of September. And this will be a face-to-face presentation. The venue will be announced and will be shared on the APM website on the events page. So do have a look at that. Quite interesting presentation coming up also from the People SIG and Stakeholder Engagement Focus Group, which is something that Claire Smith is putting forward about her work in the Crossrail Archaeology programme, which deals with stakeholders as well. So I would urge people to have a look on the events page of the APM website to see what's coming up. So thank you very much, everybody for your time. I look forward to speaking to you all again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And if I might just add one last sentence, if you're interested in becoming involved in future research, which is what we've mentioned today, I'm on LinkedIn. You can just contact me via LinkedIn. And if you're interested in stakeholders and stakeholder coping, that would be great. And thank you very much for joining us today.